Hey, everybody. We are right at noon and have a lot to cover, so I want to make sure that we get going. Just a few housekeeping things from me. I'd like to welcome everybody. This session is sponsored by the Family Violence Coordinating Council of the 17th Judicial Circuit, and we have many people from outside the circuit joining us today, so thank you so much to everybody. A few housekeeping things. Once we get going, I will put the slides in the chat in case you did not get that email with them yesterday. At the end of the session, I'll be sending out an evaluation, so please take time to complete that because those are important to us. Our presenter has requested today that you put any questions into the chat and then we will address them as time allows. Without any further ado, then I'm going to turn it over to Chair of our Family Violence Coordinating Council, Judge Jennifer Clifford. Judge Clifford.
All right. Thanks, Nikki. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for being here today. It's an important topic. I know we all are aware that this is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and we've been working with our local Family Violence Coordinating Council, as well as I'm the chair of the Illinois Supreme Court Committee on Human Trafficking and Domestic Violence. And then here in the 17th Judicial Circuit, we have our Human Trafficking Court Response Team. I know that you're not all here to hear me speak. As soon as it was announced to anyone that Jennifer Greene was going to be here, I think our number of people wanting to participate exploded. And that just speaks very highly of her. I think we all know she's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Lifespan. She had done a presentation similar to this for a committee that I'm on, and I was blown away by the information. So without further ado, the wonderful and amazing Jennifer Greene.
Thanks, Judge. That's very generous. So thanks. I appreciate the intro. Excited to be here. Seeing some old friends and some familiar faces from other trainings I've done in Rockford. Had the chance to visit. Oops, I'm moving the slides already, trying to find the go button. Have had a chance to visit in person and train up there, and I'm just down the road in Cook County. Lifespan has offices in both Des Plaines and downtown Chicago. I know that there are a lot of other experts in this Zoom room with me and with all of us. So while I've done this work, anti-trafficking work for about 15 years now, I know there's just a ton of other expertise. So thanks to everybody for joining. Prior to being at Lifespan, just a little bit of background, I was the policy advisor to the Cook County State's Attorney, worked in the State's Attorney's office for 8 years, and thanks to my boss, the elected, was able to be part of the team that built the Cook County response and start the Cook County Human Trafficking Task Force. I also am a consultant with OVC and the National Human Trafficking Training Technical and Assistance Center, which is a really long name. And prior to that, I worked at Family Rescue, which is the victim services organization in Chicago, where I oversaw a unit based out of the Chicago Police Department and the domestic violence courthouse here in the city of Chicago. So while I'm strictly in the victim service world today, I've spent a lot of time in the courts. And so it's great to see so many people here from the court system. There's so many amazing opportunities, I think, to better work in the system, to recognize trafficking and find supports for people. So without much further ado, I'm just going to dive in. And like Nikki said, putting questions in the chat would be great. We are going to keep it to an hour for the presentation, although I'll stay on for a few minutes afterwards for questions. And so, yeah, great to see you all. So just to kind of start with a frame of reference so that folks know my background and where I'm kind of coming from in this conversation. When I'm talking about engaging with victims or survivors, I'm, really coming at it from this perspective and recommending these perspectives, and that the work we are doing is responsive to trauma. Trauma-informed care and victim-centered have become really pretty strong buzzwords in the anti-trafficking field and in other fields. And so I just want to say, when we're talking about being responsive to trauma, I'm really specifically referring to the model of trauma-informed care that is promoted by the by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, which really follows, 6 key principles. And so I think it's really important that when we're talking about being trauma informed, that we really know what goes into that. And maybe there's a difference to being responsive to trauma and trauma informed. Not everybody can be trauma and provide trauma informed care. Sometimes the roles we fulfill don't allow us to do some of those things that follow that trauma informed care model. But being responsive to trauma is a critical piece of engaging with survivors of trafficking, as well as coming to this work from a place of cultural humility. Again, you may notice that many places talk about the concept of cultural competence, and I'm specifically not using that term because for me, cultural competence sort of implies that you reach this place and your learning ends and now you're competent and you don't have to keep working, where cultural humility is more of a framework that we're always learning about things that are not the same as us. And particularly for me as a white, cisgendered, hetero woman with some level of privilege, that's really critical in doing this work. We want to be empowerment based at Lifespan and in all the work that I do, really thinking about the choices that a survivor has to make and allowing them to be empowered in their choices. And then, of course, following the ethical considerations that exist within our fields and our framework. Some of us are prosecutors, some of us are judges, some of us are counselors, and we all bring our own ethical considerations to the work that we're doing. And so I'm hoping that you're going to notice this framing as I talk through this and think about how you can bring these really key elements to the work that you're doing. I also want to talk a little bit about language. You've already heard me say victim and survivor. Having worked in the criminal legal system for 25 years, I know the use of the word victim is something that's very common for us. And so that is a word I use interchangeably with the word survivor. It's important, I think, to use both. It's important to always mirror the language that the people we're working with also use, but I will use the terms victim, survivor, people with lived experience interchangeably to talk about someone who's experienced trafficking. Also, when we're talking about trafficking, or working with any survivor to be empowerment based, we want to think about the use of pronouns, what pronouns are important to that person. And again, how are we, mirroring that language that's important to the survivor for them to feel safe and empowered. So I just want to take a minute and ask people to drop in the chat, like when you think about human trafficking, what words come to mind? And you can just start dropping them in the chat. I'll keep an eye on it as we talk. But as I've done this work for about 15 years, I've really noticed a change in the way that people talk about it and refer to trafficking and even the words they use. I think we've come a long way. And so usually that's kind of indicated when we talk about this. But yes, some great words in here: youth, right? Hidden, prostitution, fraud, vulnerable, mental abuse. These are great. I can just say, I remember when starting, like people would drop in words into the chat, like ho, some other words that were really like delinquent, juvenile delinquent, right? Because at the time I started, the charge of juvenile prostitution still existed in the state of Illinois. So I always think like doing this kind of indicates how much as a society and a community we've learned about trafficking over the last 20 years or so. I think it's also, yeah, that's a great one, Kim. May not be immediately acknowledged by someone experiencing this. Yeah, they might not know. We're going to talk a lot about that. I think, it's important to think about, though, when I say, what do you think about when you hear human trafficking? Who are you picturing? Right? We still have a very large emphasis in our country and in our society of the sex trafficking of minor children, particularly minor girls. In some communities I work in, there's still a lot of the image of particularly sex trafficking of white girls that are abducted, right? But when we're talking about trafficking, you know, it happens to all kinds of people, and we're going to dive into that a little bit more. But our bias and what we bring to the table really impacts how we think about things. So when you think about the imagery you've seen of trafficking, the stories you've seen, right, the movies you've seen that really portray it happening in a certain kind of way. I mean, I always laugh about Taken, right? It's a great movie. I love Liam Neeson. It's a lot of fun, but it's not the norm of how we see trafficking in our communities at all. And our implicit bias, we all have it. It's, I think, gotten a, you know, quite a bad rap in many ways and how it's used in training, but we all have it. We all have ingrained habits and beliefs that we grew up with and that we learn, and then that impacts how we think about things. And sometimes it means that we are perceiving something in error. And so today we're really going to talk about what human trafficking is legally, what it looks like, and how to best respond to it. Okay. So I know that this is not really a 101. This is more of a 201. And like I said, there's a lot of expertise, but I do want to talk about a couple other pieces around language and then just do kind of a quick overview of what we're talking about. So speaking of language, right, we want to talk about the word rescue. For many of us in the victim service world, and when we're talking about it from an empowerment perspective, rescue is a term that really, you know, can create an uneven power dynamic, and it really doesn't regard the empowerment of the survivor. Rescuing someone, if we use that term rescue, it leads to this perception that like we rescued them, they're out and everything's now fine. And it really doesn't embrace the real impact of trafficking and the long-term impacts of trafficking. And it also really kind of perpetuates this like perfect victim narrative of like, we're going to rescue these people who need help, but what about the people who don't want to be rescued? So you'll often hear me and other people in the HT world use the term recover or encounter, because it's just a term that we really like want to think about what the use of it means. The other thing that I just want to touch on briefly is the use of the term modern day slavery. I've often, heard this. We've often, particularly 15 years ago, this was a big conversation. And at the time when I would be working on the south side of the city, which is where I worked, and particularly working in a community that was predominantly a Black community, this was a problematic situation even then. I think this term can minimize the history of the transatlantic slave trade in our country. You will always hear me say that the voice of survivors and what survivors teach us is most important. And so this statement, I think, from the National Survivor Network is really critical, that slavery and trafficking are actually two very different experiences, and that they may correlate and they might have similar structural concepts, but they really are not the same. And because of the United States history with the transatlantic slave trade, when we use this term, we might actually be confusing people as to what trafficking really looks like. People might think that they're looking for that kind of a slave trade perception, and then they're missing what's right in front of them that is an actual trafficking experience. So I just like to touch on those before we get started to frame the language that I'll be using, and how we move through this. And so here's the 101 part. A lot of you know this, so I'm going to go through a couple of slides pretty quickly, which is that human trafficking is a crime in the state of Illinois and in the United States that involves the exploitation of someone for the purpose of compelled labor or a commercial sex act. And so, and it's the critical piece here involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion. If those things aren't present, we have to really look at whether it's trafficking or not. Just historically a little bit, the anti-trafficking movement is a fairly new movement in our country. And actually in the world. It's not a new issue by any stretch of the imagination, but developing a legal response and a legal framework, really the first kind of noted experience with this was the creation of the Palermo Protocols, which happened at the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime in 2000. This really marked the beginning of folks naming human trafficking as a crime, looking at it as an organized crime issue, and then really pulling the United States, which is one of 117 countries to sign on to these protocols, into the conversation, and therefore led to the creation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act at the federal level. And Illinois actually put our first anti-trafficking law on the books in 2005. So another key piece, human trafficking by law, by definition, by for all, in every way we know it, does involve sex trafficking and labor trafficking. I often hear people say, yeah, we're doing a training on sex trafficking and human trafficking. Human trafficking involves sex and labor. Those are not two different things. They are spoken of together. They need to be looked at together. It is not uncommon that an organization might only address one kind of trafficking, but if you are planning to implement a holistic response to human trafficking, you have to be inclusive of sex and labor trafficking. I don't have to read the definitions. Y'all can read those definitions, and I know y'all know this. And so just breaking this down, I think this is a nice graphic that really points out like the process, the means, and the end. This is really just kind of describes how it happens. Trafficking can be recruiting or harboring or moving or obtaining a person. And then, right, that middle piece, forced fraud or coercion, which is so critical for forced labor or forced sex or forced prostitution. And when we're looking at human trafficking from a sex and labor perspective, we really think about forced sex and forced prostitution as a type of labor, right? So if you don't have all three of these things, you might not be looking at a human trafficking case. You might be looking at something that intersects pretty closely to human trafficking, or that might put someone at risk of trafficking, but these elements have to be involved, with the exception of minors engaged in commercial sex. Minors cannot consent to engage in commercial sex. And so forced fraud and coercion don't have to actually be proven. If somebody is facilitating a minor having sex, is helping a minor like post, that is an exception. We don't have to prove forced fraud or coercion from a legal standard. Just another piece of clarification, and I think I'm finding myself talking about this more and more as we're seeing, a growing number of new arrivals to this country and migrants, particularly in the community I live in. This is a daily conversation, right? The difference between trafficking and smuggling. And you may hear stories, and I think, as someone who works in this field, it's important to educate folks what the difference is between these. Smuggling is actually a crime against a country. It's a violation of it's an unauthorized border crossing, whereas trafficking is a crime against a person. Smuggling does not include coercion. It's usually facilitated illegal entry. And while that person can be seen as a criminal and movement is required, it's not the same for trafficking. Someone can be born in a city, raised in a city, live in that city till they die, and be trafficked. There does not have to require movement. Movement often happens in trafficking, but it's not required. So this is a really critical distinction, I think, for folks. And right, y'all know this by now, traffickers can be all kinds of people. We see a lot of intersections with domestic violence, particularly in Illinois, where we have an expansive definition of domestic violence under the Illinois Domestic Violence Act. Familial trafficking is a huge issue. It's not just boyfriends, although we do see a lot of that kind of intersection between domestic violence and trafficking. It can also be friends of family and employers, and it can be strangers. I think this piece is really where we kind of start getting into how to identify people that you might be encountering in your day-to-day work. And I know y'all come from a lot of different backgrounds, but kind of as I'm going through these next couple of slides, think about how these impact the community you serve, right? Some of the things that we know are a pathway to entry, and entry makes it seem like they're willing to be there, but some of the pathways include like that there are risk factors or vulnerabilities that might make them vulnerable to trafficking. And we're going to talk more about some of those. Could be a family business, or it could be that they're done. One of the very first cases I worked on was a case of two twin brothers who were trafficking teenage girls. And the first girl that they trafficked was gifted to them by their father, who was a pimp, and their mother, who was the bottom of his operation, right? So total family affair. Could come through seduction, which is kind of like a grooming process, recruitment, including peer-to-peer. I think for those of you who work with young people or in the child welfare system, this is a place we could see it quite often. There's still, the internet, false advertising, right? Being even approached at a mall to say like we could do modeling. I just watched a great documentary, if you haven't seen it, called American Street Kid, that does a great job of talking about survival sex, and how young people in our country are forced to engage in survival sex, which can also fall under the category of trafficking. And so when we think about vulnerabilities, we're thinking about these kind of push and pull factors, right? The things that kind of push someone towards being vulnerable to trafficking. Many of you know Mary Landerholm. That's not an unfamiliar name in the Rockford area. My good friend and former training partner. This is a slide that I use with her permission, right? So the kinds of things that could push someone to being vulnerable, and then the pull factors, right, that might come particularly that make it seem appealing, or that might make grooming possible, or that might contribute to a pathway of entry, right? So like there could be a history of abuse and in their home, but yet they are then met with this loving relationship and this idea of a family. And so those two things kind of push and pull together to contribute to how someone becomes vulnerable to trafficking. Again, I'm not going to go through every one of these in the interest of time, but I think it's really important to think about the different factors that can also make people vulnerable, right? And there's these individual factors. If this factor exists for someone, it does not necessarily mean they're going to be trafficked, but it does mean that they could be vulnerable to trafficking. And when we pair these individual factors with environmental issues that might be happening, I don't mean environmental like, the efforts to save our natural world, but the environment that we live in, right? Poverty, street economics, lack of safe adults, lack of access to services. So these individual factors combine with factors of their environment, and then our social and cultural root causes like racism and transphobia and sexualization of girls and young women and materialism, and all of those things combine to also create vulnerabilities to trafficking. And traffickers are adept at identifying vulnerabilities. I've worked with hundreds of survivors and many prosecutions, alongside many prosecutions. I can't take credit for them because I mostly worked with the survivors, but right, all of these factors often combine to make someone vulnerable, but also to actually make the trafficking possible to exist. So really, I think these 3 slides give us an opportunity to think about the populations that we work with and that we're encountering in our day-to-day world, and how we might be coming into contact with folks. Right? So just a little reminder that trafficking can be sex, labor, can happen to female or female identified, or male identified folks, or adult or minors. If we're thinking in terms of just one population, And one type of trafficking, we're not providing a holistic response, and we're missing survivors in our community. So I keep this up in our office just as a reminder to folks. And so, yeah, I mean, I want to kind of dive into more how this might happen, how you might see this. If everybody could just take a minute, I'll go through some of them, but maybe drop in the chat what you think might be a red flag or an indicator that you're across the table from someone who has experienced trafficking. What kind of red flags? And, you know, I'll say we talk a lot about screening while you're thinking about that. We talk a lot about screening, but I always promote that the recognition of red flags or indicators is 10 times more important than any screening tool that you will use. Because traffickers are smart, right? And they literally can train the folks that they've trafficked to avoid a screening questionnaire or how to answer it so that it doesn't flag well. It's not hard to say, if anybody asks you this, this, or this, you know, tell them no. So, right, let's look. No eye contact, prior victim. Yep. Talking in code, constantly checking phone. Yeah, great one. Inability to make decisions. These are great. Really good. Yeah, and so we definitely try to kind of lump them into physical and behavioral and environmental, right? Because all of these can come into play together. And so, right, we're thinking about physical being things like untreated workplace injuries or untreated injuries at all, bruising or respiratory issues, right? Because maybe someone's been strangled or maybe someone's been exposed to toxic workplace environments. Maybe a high number of sexual partners or multiple terminations. Could be physical impacts of long-term trauma like stomach aches, dental issues, right? The kinds of things that we know come as a result of experiencing trauma. Tattoos, obviously, maybe like other kinds of diseases or communicable diseases, including like hepatitis or TB. And then compared with, right, the behavioral red flags that we might see, and some of you put a lot of great behavioral red flags in the chat. Yeah, confusing or contradicting stories, distracted, avoidance, another person with them all the time. And it might not be the trafficker. I mean, it's really critical to keep in mind that any person with them could also be part of the trafficking situation. I had to fight a lot of battles in the early days with law enforcement because if they would do like a sting and put all 6, you know, girls and young women in a room together, right? The kind of coercion that could happen there if one person was like the bottom, you know, or helping the trafficker to keep the others. And so really, how do you separate folks? How do you get them in a private environment to talk? So yeah, avoiding interaction, inconsistent stories, not telling the truth, knowledge or behavior outside of their typical age range. And then these environmental factors accompanied by somebody changes in behavior, living at work or in an overcrowded situation, really looking a lot at like homeless minors, folks, not just street youth, but kids in care. So yeah, I mean, all of these together, and you can find pretty comprehensive lists. I could send one to Nikki to send out, but you know, these indicators are really critical to look at because, like I said, you're trained not to respond to screening. Many of you probably have experienced at the doctor, at least many women, that your doctor, your regular GP might do a screening for domestic violence and might ask you a question like, do you feel safe at home? Or how is your home environment? And the idea is that they're going to get someone to say to them, I'm being abused. But right, most people who are experiencing domestic violence know not to talk about that in their doctor visit. So we train medical providers to really understand injuries, right? And understand how to ask questions when they when they see these kinds of indicators. And that's equally important for y'all in the work that you're doing. So thank you all for participating in that. I'm going to just do this real quick. I know you guys are all going to know it because it's very easy example, but Cassidy comes to your program for cash assistance and help with shelter. They have recently come to your community because their family disowned them when they came out. They say they're 18, but seem much younger. While they're talking to you, they intermittently yawn and talk about how their stomach hurts. Cassidy seems nervous and is wearing long sleeves, even though it's July. When you ask for their address, they give you information for a local motel. What kind of red flags do y'all see in here? And for those of you who aren't in a service program, say they come up on your caseload, right? You encounter them in a case. And just drop any red flags in the chat. Yeah, address is a motel. Great. An appropriate dress for the season. Yeah, long sleeves, warm clothing. Right? What about the yawning? Yeah. Hiding injuries maybe, right? Their family disowned them when they came out, right? That's for sure a vulnerability. Yeah, thanks, Regina. You said it right when I did. They came to your community when they came out. So, right, what does that mean, right? That means they weren't supported. They left their home community. All of those are additional barriers. Great. Lexi, I'll have to tell you guys that this used to be a different name, but when I said it, my speaker would turn on. I can't even say it because she'll start talking to me. So if you might have heard that in another training I did, but so now we say Lexi, but Lexi comes to your program after recently coming to your community. She tells you she's from Central America and came to your community to work for a local businessman and his family. Her pay was to be $700 a week plus housing and days off. Since she has been here, Lexi hasn't had a day off and is only at your office while the children are at school. She saw your organization walking to the store. She also tells you she wants to relocate but doesn't know where her papers are because the businessman took them for safekeeping. As you talk with Lexi, you notice she has bruises along her arms and legs. When you inquire, she begins to cry. Kind of red flags here. If you could just drop them in the chat, that would be great. Yeah, boss is holding her papers. No days off. Saw you walking. She was outside. Yeah, control. It's the only way she knows about you. The bruises. Yeah. Great. Good work. Thanks, everybody. And so, yeah, I mean, I also want to talk a little bit about understanding the mindset because I mentioned how someone might pass a screening, right? Also why it might feel like someone's being resistant to us when we're trying to help them, or why it might seem like they're resistant to our questions or not telling the truth. And so you have to think about it in terms of understanding the mindset, right? And often survivors, many of us knew the concept of the Stockholm syndrome based on like the big bank robbery incident, right? And when we work from a trauma-informed care lens, we also understand that concept, we now better explain it as a trauma bond, which is intermittent experiences of violence and trauma intermingled with love and acceptance and safety, and how that creates a bond that's very hard. And that's also underscored by fear. They definitely might fear for their own safety, for the other safety of people involved, for their family and their home country, lack of autonomy. They don't even have the ability to go out on their own, but if they do, they don't know where to seek help. They have a dependence on the person. And so when we are prepared to intervene, it can become very challenging, right? Because we're working against a lot of factors. And so I think just a reminder, and again, this is an important reminder for us every day when you start engaging in this population, because you have to really remember that trauma bonds, pimp control, that severe and chronic trauma and learned hostility often means that it's challenging work, and you might get spoken to in a way you don't want to. You might be worried about someone. We had a team meeting for our human trafficking team yesterday, and we spent the whole meeting worried about someone who didn't get in touch with us at the time they were supposed to. And right, we're trying to figure out, is that a safety issue? Is she done with us? Is she going back into that life? Like, it's challenging work, but reminding yourself of this might kind of help you understand and not take it personally, but also just remind yourself so you don't get completely burnt out on it. Right? And similar to domestic violence, there's always barriers to exit. As a community of providers, we kind of come to this from this perspective of like, we have to identify this person and we have to get them out. We have to rescue them, right? We have to get them out. We have to get them into services and everything will be fine. But it's incredibly challenging for survivors to exit this situation, right? While they're being trafficked, they're often very isolated. We've already talked about trauma and self-blame. They often can't see a way out, but they also have been taught to be hostile and been taught to be secretive. They don't know it's a crime. They don't even know what they're experiencing as a crime, or that they're a victim, or that they have rights. And then the concept of criminalization, right? Which I think is really challenging when we work in systems, is that we also know this, that we in the system maybe are seeing someone who's been charged for a crime that comes as a result of their trafficking situation, or even their DV situation. And how do you balance your duty, right, and your role that you work in when someone is criminalized with offering them that help? And that's a huge challenge. Lifespan does a lot of specialized work around criminalized survivors in both the DV and the trafficking world. But the anti-trafficking world has done some really specific things around expungement of records, but we also just see a large number of survivors criminalized. And so how can you use any discretion you have in your role? How can your policies reflect that you might be able to flag someone even though they're criminalized and support them? It's a really critical part of leaving. And fear for others. I'm one of those weird people that like watches Law and Order SVU all the time. It's just on in the background, despite the fact that I do this work all day, every day. It's just a show I turn on. And one of the things that drives me crazy about Olivia Benson more and more as I watch it is that she's often saying, you have to do this so he doesn't do it to someone else. Think about the other people. And it's just horrible. And it's just not, preying on, they already have that fear for others, and preying on that fear for others is not going to help us accomplish the goal that we have to help that survivor move forward, or engage in our services. So, usually I let people kind of talk about this, but we don't have time. But are human trafficking and sex work the same thing? They are not. They are two distinct issues. Although they may correlate, right? We may see folks who are trafficked for sex who are forced to engage in sex work. That's where it's really critical to outline that force, fraud, and coercion piece. But we also have to be mindful that there are folks who engage in sex work that are not trafficked, right? And that doesn't mean that we should, I'm not saying like, great, charge this one and not that one. I'm saying it's important to understand the difference between these, because this really comes into what survivors are telling us about our approaches, about how we should think about criminalization, but also how we should approach people and how we should provide services. The differences are generally coming down to agency, who has agency to be doing what they're doing and who doesn't. Feelings of empowerment, who is doing something for survival also our systemic response, right? Folks who are engaged in sex work versus folks who are trafficking. One is seen as a offender, one is seen as a victim. But these things become, these two issues in particular are highly correlated. And I think one thing that for us at Lifespan that we often try to remember is that folks who are engaged in sex work are often also survivors of trauma. They may not have experienced human trafficking, but they also experience things like sexual assault, domestic violence, and they're at risk for trafficking. And so I just think it's important to talk about risk when we talk about risk factors and how we can provide services and how we're, thinking about what other kinds of violence people might experience and how that's playing into their involvement in the sex trade and that correlation between the two. So yeah, let's get into what makes human trafficking so hard to identify. And at this point, I do want to say that there's a lot of folks in this room, right, that provide services. And so I'm excited that there's going to be a new provider coming on board in the Rockford area, which is great. But there's also a lot of other people who are already in the Rockford area. And so when I'm talking about providers right now, I'm not specifically talking about just service providers. I'm kind of talking about everybody as being a provider, even if that's not the language you use, right? But I also want to highlight the victim service provider community as being a partner in this and a critical piece to response. And so I am going to ask at least one of those providers, I hope, to just say something about some new programming. Many of you know RACE, which is great. They've been around doing some amazing work. But Lori Graciano, are you still here from Remedies? Yes, I see you. Hopefully you're not engaged. I know there's multiple things going on. Hi, Lori. Can you just real quick talk about your program, your new announcement?
Yeah, hi. We just did receive a grant for human trafficking. We will be doing intense case management. We have just now hired 2 case managers. So they will be coming on in February and one in March. So we basically already have services for substance abuse, mental health, and domestic violence, as everybody probably well knows if you know Remedies. So right now we will be referring out to other agencies, working with the community. We'll be doing some educating to the community, just to make people aware. We will be accepting referrals as soon as our 2 people come on board. We do have our location we'll be working on it. So we're very excited to collaborate with community partners because I know it takes a whole community to serve this population.
Great.
So I'm very excited for this program.
Thanks. That's so exciting. That we were excited because Lifespan's actually been able to have this same funding, which is not just necessarily focused on one population. And when we talk about the vulnerabilities and intersection with domestic violence and substance abuse and mental health, it's a great new resource in addition to all of the other really great resources that Rockford has. And so I know Nikki started by saying if you're, to introduce yourself, but I also just want to give another opportunity for service providers in particular to drop a few things in the chat about their services, because for the next 2 slides, you're going to hear me talk about how critical victim services are. And so I want everyone to know who the victim service providers are in your community. And when I'm talking about victim service providers, I'm talking specifically about programs that just do victim services like Lifespan. I know there's lots of governmental agencies that also do victim support, but it's a critical piece. So let's talk about some of the things that make human trafficking super hard to identify. We've talked about this a lot with the actual person who's sitting across the table from us, right? they're afraid, they're ashamed, they don't have identification. So they, if people don't have identification, that also instills a fear of different systems, like the court system, like the child welfare system, like law enforcement. They're afraid of deportation, right? There's also, they might need some kind of identification to get services. They might need an address, right? They might need information about themselves that they don't have to be eligible for services. Perhaps there's a language barrier. You might have someone sitting in front of you who doesn't speak that language, and you don't have anyone that does speak that language. Also, they might feel complicit, right? They feel that they're to blame. They feel like they've done something wrong. They feel like they've broken a law. And so all of these things make it incredibly challenging for them to disclose. But on our end, there's also the trauma bonding, which we talked about. But on our end, let's think about the things that are barriers for us, right? Lacking knowledge about human trafficking. Everybody's here today. That's awesome. Everybody has experience in this room, I think, and some knowledge. So that's great. But we have to understand human trafficking, like really understand human trafficking from the survivors and from the perspective of the legal framework. And this is just even more and more challenging as we're hearing more and more things called human trafficking. We're seeing more movies, we're seeing more shows. Like, I've been privy to like a survivor list, which is great, which talks about what shows are great to watch that are good portrayals, so that if you want to learn more as providers or helpers, we may have a preconceived notion of how someone who experienced trafficking should act or appear or what that looks like. We may not understand trauma-informed care. I think I've talked about that at length. Don't believe it's our role to get involved. I've hyped up service providers a lot, but I do know that there are many people who think like that is only a service provider issue, so I don't have to be involved in this. And I think the Family Violence Coordinating Council, Judge Clifford, and many others are saying, no, we actually do have to get involved. So it's part of the reason I'm really happy to be here. Really an inadequate understanding of state, federal, or tribal laws. In Illinois, we're really lucky. I was like honored to be part of a 5-year effort with many, many people to do a entire kind of rebuild of our legal framework in the state of Illinois, that removed the charge of juvenile prostitution, right? Eliminated that from the statute, built in better ability to prove coercion, which is really challenging, expungement of crimes related to human trafficking. And we're actually really lucky in Illinois that we have a strong legal framework. But it's really important to understand those and the intention of those if you want to do the work well. And, also a lot of providers are kind of concerned about checking off boxes. And this goes to what I was saying about screening, but also just in general, sort of checking off boxes without kind of seeing the whole picture or seeing the whole signs that are in front of you. Oftentimes we feel really compelled to complete the paperwork, right? To complete the assessment, to get through the tools that we're required to do, that sometimes we just don't see the whole picture of what's in front of us. And so, yeah, I think it's just really important to keep building your knowledge base so that you know what trafficking looks like and don't think about it in just terms of being one kind of thing. And we have about 10 minutes left. I'm not going to read this to y'all. Y'all have it on a slide. Y'all know how to do it. And so I really just want to give you a chance to look at it, but also kind of keep moving through in case there are a couple of questions. I haven't seen any in the chat. I hope I didn't miss any, but I just want to do a little revisit. We sort of started talking about language, and I guess I'd love to just ask, like, does your language feel the same as when we started? Do you feel like your knowledge or your bias has been impacted? Do you feel ready to move to a next step? Anything you want to share in the chat? I noticed Someone already shared something about like the reframing of the modern day slavery, which I appreciated. But anything anybody wants to note about sort of the last hour and anything that's changed for them, and also we can move into questions. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. There is a question for Lori so that she can follow up to the new program. Anybody have any questions or thoughts that they want to share? I know I moved through a lot of things kind of quickly. Okay. Oh, thanks, Judge Clifford. Yeah, screening tools are awesome. I mean, they can be really helpful, but they can also be a check off the box kind of thing. And, you know, we helped actually specifically develop screening tools with the Cook County Task Force for the medical field, because the medical field in particular provides a really unique opportunity, because it's the one place where the medical provider often sees the survivor on their own. It's the one place where we say, you know, you can't be in here. HIPAA, they can rely on HIPAA, right? And so we help develop a screening tool. Any screening tool that is developed, I'm not saying don't use them. They just have to come with this really strong knowledge of indicators and examples, so that when you're asking those questions, the survivor might say no to all your screening questions, but you might notice that their behavior changes. You might notice that they answer no to something, but you've seen indicators of it. And so it might help you think about how you want to ask ask more probing questions. I think the other thing that's really important about screening to remember is that usually the goal of screening is to identify someone to help get them support. And in very many communities across the state, we do not have the support infrastructure that people need. We don't have it. There just aren't enough services around the state. And so you also want to make sure you have partnerships developed when you're doing screening, so that if you identify them, you know what you're going to do with it. What if they say they do want to report to the police? If you just call 911, you're going to get someone potentially who doesn't know anything about trafficking. So like, what kind of relationship have you built? If they need services, what kind of relationship have you built? And so all of this really has to be done as part of a coordinated community effort, which is what I love about the council doing it. And yeah, I mean, the question about legal services for adult survivors with respect, I love that you asked that question. That's a service Lifespan provides. Lifespan is a victim service agency, but we provide legal aid services within that organization. Many legal aid organizations have like a human trafficking team or a domestic violence team. We're an organization that provides those. And, you know, this is very challenging. The family court system, we work with survivors who have children with their trafficker or even with a customer. And we know there aren't a lot of legal services like this available around the state. Cook County and the collar counties are fairly lucky because we have more. But talk about judicial training needs. I mean, I think Judge Clifford's heard me say this. Family law judges really have, could really benefit, in my opinion, from better understanding this. Because when you have a parent who, in like perception wise, is engaged in sex work, right, that impacts their view of what kind of parent they might be. And yeah, a lot of implicit bias about trafficking. It's really why we do try to talk a lot about that and talk about different examples of films that we think are really good. I mentioned American Street Kid. There's a great show on Netflix called Sky Rojo that, if you can deal with subtitles, I think, the survivors at GEMS, which is a national survivor-led organization, did a panel about kind of the reality of Sky Rojo and how realistic that seemed. I think there's other great movies and books. Sure, I'm happy to do that. I actually just read a book recently called by Layla Motley that also is a great indication of, like, a great description, called Night Crawling, a great description of how survival sex can happen. But yeah, I'm happy to give Nikki a list. So great question. I said a whole lot more. So any other questions? Nikki's dropping some great things in the chat, like the evaluation form and the mailing list. Also, just from me, a quick thanks for engaging, for being vulnerable, for sharing things that maybe aren't easy to share. It's really important. We've talked about implicit bias. It's important to talk with other people in this field to help your learning and help your own vulnerability, and be prepared to do this work. So thanks for being engaged today, and I'll hand it back to you, Judge.
I just wanted to thank you again for being here, but also to thank all the participants. And looking through the different backgrounds of everybody is so important to me. When I got appointed to the chair of that Illinois Supreme Court Committee on Domestic Violence and Human Trafficking, I was ignorant and didn't understand the overlapping of domestic violence and human trafficking. And to be learning so much from so many people that are on this call, and Jennifer Greene in particular, and to have a Chief Judge, Judge Lowry here in Winnebago County and Boone County that has really taken up this cause and been a leader. I feel we're really lucky, and I appreciate Jennifer sharing her vast knowledge with us, and for everybody being here, because it's through programs like this that we are raising awareness, that we know what we're looking for, and that we can really help survivors. So thank you everybody for being here. Is there anything else, Nikki?
Yeah, just the boring housekeeping stuff. So I did put the evaluation link in the chat. I'll also send that out via email. We do record these and we post them on our YouTube. So there was a waiting list for today. So if you know someone that could not get in, please assure them they can watch via the YouTube, and that link will be sent out probably tomorrow. I did also put our mailing list link in there. Any sort of trainings, projects like this, resources do get sent out through our mailing list. So even if you're not in our circuit specifically, but you're interested in this type of information, please join that. And we have a Facebook page as well, which I will link in just a second here. But yes, as Judge Clifford said, thank you all for your time and attendance today. And I think that's it, unless you have any last words, Jennifer.
No, just Nikki, if you don't mind, I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes in case somebody has a question they felt shy to ask about. I can stay on for a few minutes.
Sure, I'll end the recording now, and
okay,
we'll turn that over.